This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
Tired of ads interrupting your favorite show? Good news. Ad-free listening on Amazon Music is included with your Prime membership. Just head to amazon.com/ad-free-fitness to catch up on the latest episodes without the ads. Enjoy thousands of Acast shows ad-free for Prime subscribers. Some shows may have ads.
For Digitas, this is HPE Radio, ad ID 1HPE03500000, spot title HPE Episode 2 English Radio, 15 seconds long, mixed at Harbor on October 11th, 2023.
So, how do we get AI right?
Well, we need the right volume of data and massive compute power. But with HPE GreenLake, we get access to supercomputing to power AI at the scale we need.
Search HPE GreenLake.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Are you interested in living a particularly long and healthy life? I mean, who isn't? I most certainly am. It turns out there are people in specific areas of the world who are managing to achieve just this. But how are they doing this? What are their secrets? I'm Leyla Kazim, and this is what we explore in today's episode.
I'm a big believer that when a ritual lasts for hundreds or thousands of years, like prayer before a meal, it serves some purpose. A lot of what I've observed in the Blue Zone, especially when you see it in 5 disparate parts of the world, you start to say, hey, maybe we ought to pay attention to that.
This is Dan Buettner, a National Geographic Fellow and a best-selling author and expert on the Blue Zones. These are 5 parts of the world where people tend to live longer and healthier lives, often reaching their 100th birthday.
In other words, these are people who are achieving the capacity of our human machine. They're living into their mid-90s without diabetes or heart disease or certain types of cancers or even dementia.
For over 20 years, Dan Buettner has been focusing on the practices of some of the planet's oldest people. It's led to books, hundreds of thousands of social media followers, and a hit series on Netflix.
And these secrets could help every one of us to get every good year we can get out of this body of ours. That is the promise of Blue Zones.
In this episode, I want to try to find out what Dan's research might be able to teach us in the UK and how our life expectancies compare. You'll hear the secrets go much further than diet. They're really about a way of living. But for this programme, which is of course all about food, I'll focus mainly on the culinary side of things, what and how they are eating. Before we go any further, where in the world are these Blue Zones?
Okinawa, I think, was the very first longevity hotspot. It wasn't called a Blue Zone. I called it a Blue Zone. The Wilcox brothers, Craig and Bradley Wilcox, along with Dr. Suzuki, they identified the longevity phenomena there in the 1990s. And my first expedition was to Okinawa in 1999.
Then came Sardinia in Italy in around 2003.
And then I named Loma Linda, California, Blue Zone.
Loma Linda, home to one of the highest concentrations of Seventh-day Adventists in the world.
And then with the National Geographic grants, we identified a Blue Zones in Costa Rica in 2006, and then the Blue Zone in Icaria in 2009.
What your audience are particularly interested in, including your large social media following, is what you have discovered about how these people live and the commonalities amongst them, because it's not just about what they eat, is it?
I mean, it's fairly easy to discern what they're eating, but what's as important is the mutually supporting web of characteristics that help them shed stress, that keep them moving, that keep them socially connected. These are things that when I first started writing about Blue Zones, nobody knew loneliness was dangerous, and nobody knew the importance of simply walking as opposed to running marathons. Nobody knew the importance of having a sense of purpose and how that can add years to your life. These are the things that people unconsciously do in blue zones that account for much of their longevity. And then, yes, their diet, unquestionably, I would say their diet's probably 50% of the formula.
Dan Buettner talks a lot about reverse engineering longevity. But how can we in the UK possibly follow any of this when everything about our lives and where we live is so different?
The wrong way to look at blue zones is to say, well, they're different than us and we can't do that. And rather to say, oh, this constellation of things works at delivering healthy, happy humans. Let's take some lessons for that and try to reshape the environments we live in. And therein lies the opportunity.
I've arranged to speak to two academics who have made it their mission to try to reshape how we live our lives so they are longer and healthier. Liz says this is partly happening because of regional differences.
Hi, Leyla. I'm Liz Williams. I'm a senior lecturer in human nutrition at the University of Sheffield, and I'm based in our Healthy Lifespan Research Institute at the university. And my particular interest is in diet and healthy aging.
I'm Oliver Shannon. I'm a lecturer in nutrition and ageing at Newcastle University. And very much like Liz, I'm interested in nutrition and healthy ageing, and particularly healthy dietary patterns like, for example, the Mediterranean diet.
So Liz, the current life expectancy in the UK is just over 81 years old, but your work isn't necessarily around making us live longer. It's more about increasing the number of healthy years that we have towards the end of our lives. So has this been improving in recent years?
Yeah, so we've seen really significant gains over the last century in terms of our life expectancy. And we have seen some improvements in our healthy life expectancy. So that's the period of your life that you report that you're living in good health. And so whilst our life expectancy is around 80 years, our healthy life expectancy is around 63 years on average. So whilst there have been some gains, those gains have slowed down.
Liz says this is partly happening because of regional differences.
The more deprived areas have a lower healthy life expectancy that can be a difference of up to 18 years.
That's just such a huge percentage of someone's life. Oliver, your special interest is brain health and delaying or halting the onset of dementia. What do you think about Dan's research?
Yeah, so I think what he does is particularly good for raising awareness in the general public. So there's often this challenge in science that we carry out research and it never really leaves the dusty corridors of academia. I think it's really interesting to see what he picks out is actually broadly consistent with what we see from other sources of evidence as well. So a couple of the blue zones are actually areas in the Mediterranean region. And we're really interested in how the typical eating habits and lifestyle of individuals in the Mediterranean generally seems to be linked with better health and longevity. And we've shown in a UK setting as well that individuals who tend to follow a more Mediterranean type diet seem to have a low risk of developing dementia.
The government's white paper on levelling up sets an intention to increase the number of healthy years we have at the end of our lives by 5 years, and it aims to achieve this by 2035, which sounds like quite far away actually. Liz, do you think this target is ambitious enough, and do you think it's achievable?
It might be achievable, but we really need to see some radical changes, and we need to see those radical changes now. Some of the steps we can do is to stop unhealthy food marketing aimed at children and to encourage good habits in childhood. And by changing our physical environment that enables people to be more physically active. So the longer we can live well, the greater our contribution will be to society, the less the draw we will have on our NHS. So much of this, comes down to giving people job opportunities and paying them appropriately, and so that they can afford to feed their families. One, real concern is the increasing reliance on food banks. So if anything, at the moment, I feel as if we're moving in the wrong direction.
Liz Williams. We raised these concerns with the government's Department of Health and Social Care, and they told us,
we're taking strong action to encourage people to make healthier food choices, including bringing in calorie labelling in many eateries. The sugar reduction programme is helping cut the amount of sugar in foods eaten by children, including an almost 15% decrease from breakfast cereals. We continue to encourage people to be more active and have a range of free apps such as Couch to 5K.
This is the food programme for BBC Radio 4 and I'm Leyla Kazim. Today we're finding out about research into parts of the world where people have been found to live longer, healthier lives, known as blue zones.
It's important to realize that if you want to know what a 100-year-old ate to live to be 100, you have to know what she was eating as a little girl.
Back to my Zoom interview with Dan Buettner. I want to know what these centenarians have been eating all their lives and how Dan and his team have been able to find this out.
My team aggregated 155 dietary surveys done either by universities or the government over the past 80 years in all 5 blue zones. What emerges is that they're eating mostly a whole food, plant-based diet. It shocks a lot of people to discover it is mostly carbohydrates. It's a high-carb diet. But carbs is a horrible word because both jelly beans and lentil beans are carbs. And obviously, the blue zone diet is the latter.
There are 5 types of foods that are eaten across all 5 blue zones. And these are
whole grains, corn, wheat, and rice, greens, wild or other garden vegetables, tubers like sweet potatoes. Interestingly, in Okinawa, until 1970 or so, 2/3 of all the calories that they consumed came from sweet potatoes, purple sweet potatoes called emo. And then nuts for snacking. And the cornerstone of every longevity diet in the world are beans. And if you're eating a cup of beans a day, it predicts an extra 4 years of life expectancy.
And of course, there are also foods they eat less of.
So very little meat about 5 times per month. Very little fish, once or twice a week maybe. No cow's dairy, interestingly. And about a quarter as much refined sugar as we have. And the refined sugar usually shows up in the form of honey or sweets during holidays, but they're not, eating candy bars and cookies and crackers all day long.
So would you say that it's the foods that these people are eating, or is it what they're not consuming that is keeping them healthier?
It's more what they're not consuming. So the United States, we lose about 680,000 Americans every year to the standard American diet, which means processed food. Most of the foods in our grocery stores have added sugar, or they're processed. The soda pops, these are things unknown to people in blue zones. The reason people live a long time in the blue zones because they eat this whole food, plant-based diet mostly, but also because they do it for a long time. And the reason they do it for a long time is this interconnected web of mutually supporting factors. They're eating wisely because their lives are underpinned with purpose. They have an immediate social circle of people who eat and cook the same way that they do. And they live in places where the healthy choice is the easy choice. The cheapest, most accessible foods are these peasant foods. And they know how to make them taste delicious, and their friends are eating these all the time. So when it comes to longevity, there's no short-term fix.
I think anyone who's ever carried out a kind of an intervention study with participants will tell you it can be incredibly difficult to help people change their behaviours. You're fighting against all sorts of different challenges and barriers.
Dr. Oliver Shannon, lecturer in nutrition and ageing at Newcastle University, is also interested in how to change people's diets for the long term.
One of the key barriers we have at the moment in society is the cost of living crisis, which means that food prices in particular have undergone huge rates of inflation, and it's really difficult for some people to afford to eat a healthy diet. But we've shown in some of our studies that it is actually possible with the right approaches to encourage healthy dietary changes which do last in the long term.
So what did you find in your research about how easy it is to actually change people's behaviours?
There's a study called MedX UK where we were looking to see if we could encourage older adults in the UK to adopt a more Mediterranean type diet. And we found with a 6-month intervention, their adherence to a Mediterranean diet was much better at the end of the study period. And equally, when we followed them up at 12 months, the participants were still maintaining most of the good dietary changes.
I wanted to speak to someone who has managed to change their diet and lifestyle. So Dr. Shannon put me in touch with 73-year-old Jean Newton from Wallsend near Newcastle, who had taken part in one of his trials. It started in the months before the pandemic, and it intended to look at the effect of the Mediterranean diet on brain health, and in particular dementia. Sadly, the pandemic meant they couldn't finish all the tests they wanted to do, but it did help show that lifestyle change is possible. Here's Jean.
I wanted to do the trial because on the advertisement about it, it said it was research for Alzheimer's, and I thought, and that's always my biggest fear, is getting Alzheimer's. Before I went on the trial, I tended to eat a lot of red meat, a lot of veg, which I still do, fried food. I used ordinary oil for frying or actual fat. I didn't do a great deal of exercise.
During the trial, the participants in Jean's group were given £30 vouchers per week to spend on the foods typical to the Mediterranean diet.
I think the biggest difference in what I was eating was I was having a lot of virgin olive oil, a good grade of olive oil. Instead of eating red meat now, I'll eat a lot of fish. I find the fish goes ideally with the peppers and the courgettes. I eat a lot of broccoli and sprouts, and I tend to fry them in olive oil with garlic in.
3 years on, and Jean says she hasn't gone back to her old ways.
I don't think as you get older, it's hard to change old habits. In fact, it's an easier way to cook. It takes no effort at all to have a big pan, throw some oil in and throw all your vegetables in and your fish, and it is so tasty. If I go out on an evening, I'll have a steak as a special treat. I walk a lot, and people always comment on how active I am now, and I do put it down to that diet, and being able to stick to it, it's been very easy to stick to.
Jean has, for the most part, stopped eating red meat. She's replaced it with lots of chicken and fish. In the blue zones, Dan Buettner says meat rarely features, and he sometimes gets criticised online for saying this. He refers to this way of eating as a plant slant. I asked him what he meant by that.
Blue zone diet is not a restrictive diet. It's not a finger-wagging diet. When I say plant slant, it's between 90 and 98% of their calories come from whole plant-based sources. Not today. If you go there today, it's a different story. But I mean traditionally over the last 100 years, and that's what I'm interested in. The most important ingredient in any longevity diet is taste. And their genius is not some magical herb or some spice or coral calcium. It's over the centuries, from mother to daughter to mother to daughter, they've improved these recipes to learn how to, for example, make beans taste delicious so you don't miss the slab of meat.
On Dan's YouTube channel, there are videos from his visits to the Blue Zone regions going back a long time. This one is from 15 years ago in Nicoya, Costa Rica.
In America, only 1 in 7 women over 100 can even take care of themselves. Panchita not only lives alone, she splits log and clears the bush with an enormous machete. Last November, when she turned 100, the entire village celebrated with her. On any given afternoon, a half a dozen friends will show up to visit or just help out. Her young neighbor, Luis, always stops by at 5 to put the chickens away. Panchita headed into her kitchen.
She stoked her fogone, the traditional chorotego clay oven, fried eggs, seasoned her beans with garlic and onions, and then cut fresh cheese. It seemed like a huge dinner for such a small woman, but we soon discovered
she made food for us.
It really humbled me to receive food from such a poor woman. "Food gives life," she shouted. "You must eat." We convinced her that she and Luis needed the food worse than we did. We left at 6 o'clock. By 7, she would be in bed. She'd pray for a half hour and then sleep.
Dan Buettner in Nicoya, Costa Rica. Dan has called another ritual, identified in all 5 blue zones, the 80% rule.
In blue zones, they all have unconscious strategies to engineer food or calories out of their diet. For example, the Adventists have a saying, eat breakfast like a king, lunch like a prince, dinner like a pauper. And then they leave their digestive systems to rest. That's kind of the trend in all blue zones. They pre-plate their food and put the leftovers away before the meal, so they're not tempted by that second or third helping. And you always see some form of gratitude before the meal. You know, the Mediterranean, it's a prayer. In Okinawa, they say harahachi bu, which is a Confucian adage to remind them to stop eating when their stomachs are 80% full. But they're putting this punctuation between their busy lives and their eating. You know, the food usually took some work to make its way to the table, and there's some appreciation for that food, and they honor it, eat it slowly, taste it, and connect with their family and friends.
Dan says eating until you aren't quite completely full and eating slowly with family and friends can help you live longer. I put that to Liz Williams.
Yeah, so the notion of eating until you're about 80% full really comes back to basic physiology, and it's giving your body the time to send the signals to the brain to say, I've eaten enough. And given the high proportion of our population who are overweight or obese, that tells us that clearly we do have something wrong with our regulation of energy intake in this country. But it's also important to be aware that as people get older, their appetites do decline. And so I think we have to be very careful with that messaging, because an older adult may start to lose their appetite. And in those circumstances, it's really important that they are consuming a nutrient-dense diet, so a diet that is providing them with enough micronutrients and the right amount of protein and so on. Lots of the high-fat and high-energy foods that we are consuming, they're extremely palatable. So they are designed to make us want to eat more, and they don't necessarily fill us up.
So what about drinking alcohol? Are the people living to 100 in blue zones teetotal? The answer is no.
I just looked at a survey of 90-year-old Icarians, and over 80% of them said they drink wine every day of their adult life. And guess what? They're making it in their mid-90s and hundreds, still cognitively sharp and vital. But I think part of the secret is what they're drinking and how. First of all, they're drinking organic red wine, usually homemade. Secondly, they're drinking it with friends. And they also drink it with their blue zone diet. So I have not changed my habits. Now, I'm quick to say if you're not drinking now, don't start drinking. It's not a blue zone recommendation to drink. But if you're drinking it moderately with friends, and especially with the blue zone meal, I'm not here to tell you not to.
I'm not surprised by Dan's advice here. I make my own elderberry wine at home, and I'm pretty sure that a little bit most days is doing me no harm. But what do the academics say?
This is a very interesting one, and possibly the most difficult question you've asked me today. One of the key recommendations you often see in the Mediterranean diet is to have a small amount of red wine every day. And that actually, in some areas, seems to conflict with other guidelines we have to say that alcohol might be associated with negative health effects. So that the way in which we try to balance this in studies that we've carried out is by suggesting that if people already drink, they're possibly best doing that around meal times, and equally possibly in the form of red wine, which we know is rich in polyphenols and might have some protective chemicals in there which could be good for our body. Whereas if people are teetotal, generally our recommendations aren't that they start drinking more alcohol.
I'm personally also very interested in the effect of fermented foods and wondered if that was something that had come up in Dan's research.
Some, wine is a fermented food. Sourdough bread is really big in Sardinia, and you have tofu and a lot of fermented foods, and miso in Okinawa. In the Nicoya Peninsula of Costa Rica, every table will have a big chilero, which is this jar of chiles that just sits there in the sweltering heat for days, but because it's fermented, it doesn't go bad. You'll see a little yogurt in Icaria, Greece. You'll see some fermented sheep's milk and cheese in Sardinia. So yeah, there is an element of fermented food, but not like this proactive, let's pound probiotics and get healthier. They just eat.
So what do the people in these places think about being included in this project? And do they ever think, what's so special about what we're doing? We're just kind of living normally. Or do they appreciate that it's actually quite a different way of living?
Nobody's asked me that question, but it's a very insightful question, because actually when I first started showing up there, they had no idea. They're just living their lives. But when you find centenarians, people want to tell their story. They love it. They've been on the planet 100 years. They've acquired a lifetime of wisdom. And now in some of the blue zones, especially Icaria, Greece, it's a huge source of pride. And young people, 20-year-olds, are bringing back the old wine techniques and the old food techniques. And older people are rock stars there. In the Nicoya Peninsula, it's been a little corrupted. The business people, the hoteliers and the crappy restaurant owners, they've kind of taken on the name in a way that I'm not very happy about. But for the most part, these places have become popular destinations with really responsible people who are interested in learning. They love it.
So is Dan expecting to find any more blue zones?
No. And the reason is because of the standard American diet. Once it arrives in these blue zones, longevity goes out the back door. As soon as the chips and the sodas and the burgers and the pizza places start appearing, their life expectancy starts dropping.
I think we may lose the blue zones in the form that they are existing in at the moment. And I think they may be lost quite rapidly. I think the example of Costa Rica, where we've seen the fast food restaurants have moved in and they've already seen declines in their life expectancy.
And actually, if you look at Okinawa in Japan, I believe if you look at different districts in Japan, Okinawa is not even the top within Japan for life expectancy anymore. So the practices which are being common there might be diluted with other behaviours in younger generations.
But I think there are opportunities to learn from them and to recreate some aspects of those in today's modern societies. And Singapore is one example where they have designed their roads, their living to sort of encourage those characteristics of the blue zones. And so I think that's perhaps more important and will be of greater benefit to people.
Liz Williams from the Healthy Lifespan Institute at the University of Sheffield and Dr. Oliver Shannon from the University of Newcastle. Before we go, one last question for Dan Buettner. Sometimes people can feel a bit overwhelmed by new advice and new lists and stuff. So if you had one piece of advice or one takeaway that people could take from your research that is quite achievable and attainable for most people, what would it be?
Learn how to make beans taste delicious to you.
And coincidentally, we have a 2-part episode about Dan's recommendation. It's all about beans and why they're so good for you and the planet. Just search for the food programme Beans in BBC Sounds. Thanks for listening. I'm Leyla Kazim, and this programme was produced by Natalie Donovan for BBC Audio in Bristol. Do let us know your thoughts about today's programme. We're on social media at BBC Food Prog, or you can email us. The address is thefoodprogram@bbc.co.uk.
If anyone is an artist in their soul, it's Joni Mitchell.
There are some artists that change music forever.
The mastery of the guitar, the mastery of voice, the mastery of language.
That shape the musical landscape for everyone who comes after.
When the dust settles, Joni Mitchell may stand as the most important and influential female recording artist of the late 20th century.
Legend is a music biography podcast from BBC Radio 4 that explores the extraordinary lives of musical pioneers.
I think people would like me to just be introverted and bleed for them forever.
Legend, the Joni Mitchell story, with me, Jessica Hoop. Listen now on BBC Sounds.
Tired of ads interrupting your favorite show? Good news. Ad-free listening on Amazon Music is included with your Prime membership. Just head to amazon.com/ad-free lifestyle to catch up on the latest episodes without the ads. Enjoy thousands of Acast shows ad-free for Prime subscribers. Some shows may have ads.
For Digitas, this is HPE Radio, ad ID 1HPE03500000, spot title HPE Episode 2 English Radio, 15 seconds long, Mixed Harbor on October 11th, 2023.
So, how do we get AI right?
Well, we need the right volume of data and massive compute power. But with HPE GreenLake, we get access to supercomputing to power AI at the scale we need.
Search HPE GreenLake.